get going, I just want to thank our sponsors, Arri, Estura, Two Close Lenses, Lightgear, Panavision, and Taylor. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Katie.
I'm going to share my screen now. Tanya, do you want to do some intro?
So I think the first things we wanted to clarify, and I'm Tanya, I handle all the marketing for the Sony Burano and all of our cinema cameras. So first with the Burano, we wanted to kind of like, we think it's a really exciting camera. We've like kind of built this legacy based on the Sony Venice that's been used on over 500 different productions. And the Burano sits right under the Venice. Katie's going to go into more detail on it, but it really adds a lot of mobility. It's a smaller form factor than actually the Sony Venice, but they do not share the same sensor as the Sony Venice. That's probably one of the most important things that we'll share. We're going to show you a number of different assets, downloadable tools, and you'll be able to find all of them on sonycine.com. And with that, I'll hand it off to Katie.
Thank you. So as Tanya mentioned, I'm going to try and go over a little more quickly over the basics because last time you guys really wanted the real technical stuff. So I'll get into that a little faster. So just the basic overview, all the things that you guys have seen online. It's the newest camera. It's the first cinema camera that has the mount, E-mount, in-body image stabilization, and auto ND all wrapped in one package. And it fills the gap right in between the FX9 and the Venice. Here's just like kind of like a quick chart when you're comparing kind of the Venice 2, the Burano, and the FX9 and where that sits. And the in-body image stabilization is such a huge factor that I think a lot of people, just like when autofocus came out in the FX9 and everybody was like, ew, we don't want to use that. And then now everybody's obsessed. I feel like in-body image stabilization is going to be that kind of next step in technological advancement. And people starting to learn, rely a lot more on some of the like automatic functions inside of a camera, especially for the market, like the single camera operator, the run and gun, documentary, sports, all of those things. Just like a brief overview when we're going to look at the Burano versus the Venice 2 in terms of weight. The height is very similar. The length, the Burano is a lot shorter than the Venice 2. But in terms of weight, when you build out the two cameras with, follow focus, MDR, PL lens, Teradek, all that stuff, they end up weighing very close to each other, but regardless, it's still 2 pounds lighter. And again, being single camera operator, that the Burano can function with a much more slim build, where the Venice 2 is definitely more crew oriented. If we look at it next to the FX9, the FX9 doesn't even come with a PL adapter out of the box. That's something that's separate. And so in terms of power draw, the FX9 does draw a lot less. If we go to the Venice 2 versus the Burano power draw is like right in the middle of the Venice and the FX9. The FX9 is not that much lighter than Burano, which I was surprised, especially if you add the XDCA onto the FX9 at that point. It weighs almost the same, if not a little more, the FX9 after the XDCA. And then the other camera we really want to talk about is the F55. Oh, love the F55. But I think a lot of people who were F55 owner operators and users might have been hesitant to switch to the FX9. We think that the Burano is probably going to fill that gap in everyone's heart, that they were kind of using because the F55 still works so much, as I'm sure a lot of you guys know. But the Burano can, I think, really stand the test of time like the F55 has. One of the big things is obviously not the same sensor. When you start putting the look of the Venice versus the FX9 and the Burano, those are going to look and match easier when you're mixing and matching, but the F55 does look pretty different. And a lot of that is obviously technology, the new color science that came about and all those things. And I think once you build out the F55 also, I didn't realize how heavy it gets after you have to add the R7 on to make it to give you the OCN like what the Burano has internally. Just from kind of like a button standpoint, it's very much more, a lot of the buttons are on the operator side, less buttons than the FX9, but more buttons than the Venice 2. There's 11 assignable buttons. Good luck to you if you can remember all of them. There's so many, but not to mention on the handle, there's like an optional grip this way, it comes here. So there's an optional grip. And the thing I like, there's like a quick release on the optional grip, unlike the FX9 where you had to like unscrew it mechanically and it took like, it was not something you could do quickly. This release on the grip is really cool. I like it a lot. And then just kind of like the Gazintas and Gazatas, the SDIs, HDMIs, all the fun things. And you also have not just the grip remote, but grip control, but you also have like the remote right next to it. So that way you don't have to choose one or the other, that you can run both. The viewfinder is an LCD. It's 720, but one of the biggest advancements is that you can push the home button and it looks very similar to like a Venice style setup, or an easier menu layout that many people are going to be more familiar with, or more intuitive, that they might pick up a little bit easier. But you can still access the deep menus. I've just assigned a button and I just push and hold the number 8 button that's on the viewfinder. And that's how I get into the deep menus if I really wanted to, and then I can exit. But I also have a picture. For the single camera operators, we are finding that this is obviously on their side, or a lot of people and a lot of third-party accessories are figuring out ways how to mount it on the AC side of it. So that way you can have the viewfinder on one side and then use like a larger, small HD or something like that on the other. We talked about the optional grip. It has a bunch of buttons, but I oddly enough, my favorite thing is this quick release of all the things that it can do. Like Tanya mentioned, not the same sensor. That's probably the #1 question that we get in person, on the internet, all the forums. They are not the same sensor. Oh, we have a hand raised. Wait, oh, did I do that? Oh, that's so cool. I didn't mean to. AI is crazy. They're not the same sensor. The Venice 2 has a different sensor. The FX9 has a different sensor. Burano has a different sensor. They all have different sensors, but they just have a similar color science because they're all coming from the same family, Sony. They do have 16 plus stops of dynamic range in similarity. The dual base ISO is also in similarity in that it's 800 and 3200. As we found with the as we found with the Venice 2, just some things that I always bring up is, and I've been seeing it a lot with the Burano in particular, as I see people just start poking around, is that they are accidentally, like if they want to go to a 3200 base, they'll be at 800 and they'll toggle up to 3200 as opposed to doing all the button pushes to get to the 3200 base. And so that's just one thing that I have noticed a lot of people doing inadvertently. How do I make my hand go away? Lower hand, there we go. Okay. And then I'm gonna make this go bigger.
So, Katie, let me just check. Are there any questions yet? She's gonna go over the very basics right now, and then we're gonna get more technical, but we want to make sure that everyone has the same starting point.
I'm doing
no
good.
questions yet, Katie? Go ahead, yeah.
Okay, 11 minutes. We've already covered a lot of ground. Okay, so for the dual base ISO, just for fun, as opposed to the Venice 2, where you have to do on the AC side. So I've assigned my #1 button to be my base ISO, or if I push home and I push here, I do base ISO, and then you can change your base from there. So there's multiple functions and multiple ways to do that. Electronic variable ND, something else that's different from the Venice 2 and from the F55, similar to the FX9. It's an LCD screen that drops in front of the sensor. It changes its opacity to be able to achieve the 8 stops of ND seamlessly and varied. The Venice, as many of us know, is 2 turrets that spin between themselves, and it's physical glass. So one of the benefits to having the LCD is that it's seamless. You can walk in and out of the building, and you can either operator roll it in, or there's also the auto ND, which is really, really great. So that's a benefit. One of the downsides is that the LCD drops in starting at 2 stops, as opposed to the Venice has single stop increments, clear 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this one is clear 2 stops and then. So, but I think that this is obviously a function, again, single camera operator coming from the FX9 world. Oh, one of the things that I also like to bring up that not a lot of people know about when you're doing the auto ND itself, that there are 3 functions when you're in the auto exposure mode. You can set it to standard, backlit, or spotlit. And I think when people say that they don't like auto ND, it's because they're not aware of these 3 functions. So standard is what it comes out of the box like, and it's essentially taking exposure the way that you would. It's balancing your highlights and your shadows as best as it can. When you do backlit, for obvious reasons, it takes your highlights into account more so than your shadows, and it notes that you might want to get closer to overexposing your highlights to be able to save your shadows, and then vice versa for spotlight. The way that I would do that is I just push home. I would actually push in on my scroll wheel to go to the direct menus, and there's like a gold box that populates. And I scroll over to where it says AE, I select in, and then it says backlit, standard, or spotlight. I know that's a little difficult to see, but generally that's just that's how you can change it quickly. Oh, here's just a nice little example. It drops in, it starts at, and it says 0.6. That's exciting. As opposed to fractional light transmittance, because we all speak in fractional light transmittance, don't we? But this is exciting. One of the things that I was very excited about was this, because it also gives me hope that it will be updated in the other cameras as well. Okay, in-body image stabilization. Yes.
Katie, so we just had a question regarding the variable ND. So Brian McGraw from Cinema Mechanics wants to know if there's any issues using polarizers with the variable ND.
That's a good question. We get that a lot. We haven't seen any issues or heard of any issues with combining the 2 of those. Has anybody else in the chat experienced any or had any of those questions, or had any issues? If anybody has, please let us know. We are interested, but as far as I know, I haven't heard any issues or experienced any issues. Good question. Oh. Okay, so in-body image stabilization. This is the thing that I was mentioning. It's I think it is incredibly cool. It seemed like it was a hit in the FX3, and so they said, let's put it in the Burano. So there are 2 kinds of in-body image stabilization. There is the 3-axis, which is yaw, pitch, and roll. And then there's the 5-axis, which includes Y and X as well. With the Burano, when you're shooting with a manual lens, so something that isn't a Sony E-mount, so it could be a third-party E-mount, it could be a PL lens, any of that, you will have the ability to use 3-axis in-body image stabilization, and it has various intensities of low and high in the manual world. Does somebody have a question?
I know someone's not on mute. Please mute your cameras unless, or please mute your screens unless you have a question. Go ahead, Katie.
So then there's 5-axis in-body image stabilization. The 5-axis is what you'll get with an Sony E-mount lens going to E-mount on the Burano. And you'll have 2 or 3, you'll have 2 variations of that you'll have standard and active. The way to standard will be available for most of the imager modes. As you can imagine, the more of the imager that you're using, the less room you have to stabilize. As you turn off the parts of the imager you're not using and essentially crop in on the sensor, you will have more room to stabilize. Standard stabilization is more of a mechanical, more of a mechanical mechanism, and that's how it's, making the compensation. Active activates a digital compensation as well as a physical compensation. To get to active, you'll want to be in, I think it's a 5.7, I'll double check it when we go to the side of the camera, a 5.7 Super 35 imager mode or a 5.2, and that will allow you to go to a active image stabilization. So if I go to the side of the camera, and I'm gonna stop sharing just so that way my camera is larger. Oh, am I dying? I am. I'm gonna go get a battery. Does anybody have questions about image stabilization before I start diving into the menus?
Does anybody have questions regarding the 3-axis stabilization or the 5-axis stabilization?
And just for fun,
the stabilization is you're able to shift the stabilization so that you're able to go from, what is it, Katie? It's, you can turn it off. The highest mode would be active, and then that middle mode is standard.
Yeah. As you also just saw, I pulled the battery and then put it back on. It boots up and makes a picture in about 3 seconds, and I think you can start rolling in about 4 or 5 seconds. So I'm going to push and hold to go into the deep menus, and I am going to go to shooting, and I'm going to go to image stabilization. And as you'll see, I have low is what it says right now on the side of the camera. High is grayed out because I can't do it, or I can turn it off. You'll definitely want to turn it off when you are in a gimbal situation, and that just basically turns off the physical mechanism. But low is what I have available. And then something else you'll notice, because I have a PL lens on, if I select in on the focal length, I can assign what focal length I have on, and I actually have a 15. The menu. So you are able to do different imager modes as well as different record modes. So when you're in XAVC versus when you're in OCN, we'll offer various image stabilization options. But when you've got a PL, you definitely don't want to be in auto. You're going to want to be in manual and change or manually select what focal length you'll want. If you have a zoom PL, I recommend to probably just turn it off, or test is the other one. If you have time to test, just to see how the image stabilization does and you guess the focal length. But if you're doing anything that's E-mount, Sony E-mount, it's speaking electronically, so it knows how much stabilization to assign or not. So that's when auto would be available. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. And then these are just in the manual, these are just the quick on how to get there and what's available. You can also assign it to a user button, so that way you can activate it and deactivate it, or engage and disengage as quickly as possible. Imager modes and resolutions. So these are the imager modes that are available. Everything that's coming out of the Burano is going to give you a 16:9 or 17:9 recording. There isn't going to be an open gate option. If you would like open gate, Venice 2 is going to be the camera for you. One of the other questions that we often get also is for anamorphic. We have in anamorphic, there's a 1.3 D squeeze and a 2x D squeeze currently. Because the industry and because of the Mercuries, the 1.5 will be coming in a version 1.1 of the camera. I believe that is it fall? that they're targeting. I have it at the end of the deck when the firmware, like for a firmware roadmap. And then in the next version 2, they believe for Burano, is they're going to have a square imager mode that's 4.3 that will be geared towards anamorphic. Until then, that was another question we always get, is basically like, until then, what's best practices? And I'm using Small HD as just an example, but a lot of people tend to use Small HD. They have an anamorphic mode that you can add in there. They've got every option. And they also have frame lines, and they also have a crop, so that way you can crop and scale. So that way you can chop off the edges and only look at whatever it is that you're delivering. So, and that's something that we have been showing people as well. Frame rates and resolutions. The highest frame rate that you're going to be able to do is 120 right now in the Super 35 cropped mode. But Sony is looking into, the engineers are looking into higher frame rates at different imager modes. So they're working on it. They just don't know the time frame on that yet. And on Sony Cine, there's this really sick, it's called a poster on Sony Cine, but it's got a really good, like, quick one sheet of imager modes, resolutions, the codecs, and the frame rates all in one. And it's a really good visual. Tanya did a good job on it.
Nice.
Recording codecs.
Honestly, like, it was getting so bummed.
Hello. Hi, Bianca. Recording codecs. XOCN LT, that's something that everyone's really excited about because it's 16-bit linear off of the sensor, and it's going into Sony's proprietary XOCN codec, which is in the Sony universe, the most efficient RAW, or the most efficient, the most efficient RAW. Video codecs. There's an XAVC, so XAVC-I, just like everything else. XAVC-H, there's a intra HQ and an SQ and a long GOP. The HQ and SQ are newer iterations of XAVC to be able to wrap the larger resolution with the larger imagers. We don't imagine, so far, just about everyone that we've talked to about who's used the Burano or experienced it or come across it or knows about it, we don't see a lot of people doing XAVC HQ or SQ. We see that if they're doing the 8K and they're doing the full frames and things like that, they're likely just going to use the OCN LT, but that a lot of people, if they do want XAVC, that they'll just stay in like the 4K world, which you get XAVC-I outside of full frame essentially. So it's just once you go into the 8K full frames, then you'll have to, so let me go back to the imager modes. So when you're in the 8K full frames, then you'll have an XAVC HQ and SQ option. And then as soon as you go into like the 6K 17.9s and the 5.8K, then you'll have the standard XAVC-I available. New camera, new card, not new to the industry, new to Sony, so that's exciting. They write faster, just means that the cards are what help us get the internal OCN LT, XOCN LT inside of the camera internally. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with it. CF Express Type B, a lot of manufacturers have started using these as well. Sony just jumped on board, and they will have cards that are 1.9 or almost 2 terabytes. In terms of record times, another chart that is incredibly helpful. The data calculator is being worked on. Until then, this is a great way to kind of talk about if you have a 960 gigabyte card in at different imager modes and resolutions and frame rates, here the record times are here. So if you're doing, I think OCN LT is probably the closest one. If you're shooting at 24, OCN LT at full frame, full resolution, you're getting 74 minutes. That's crazy. You do a whole hour interview like that. Autofocus. This is another one that's really exciting. The autofocus in the camera is getting better. It's getting faster. It also is dependent upon the lens. So if you have an older Sony lens, then the autofocus isn't going to be as robust as if you were to use a newer Sony lens. So that does make a difference just because of the technology available at the time versus now. But it is touch that you can do. I don't have an autofocus lens on here, but you would be able to just tap and touch on the monitor, just like with an FX6 or an FX9 or an FX3 for that matter. And it has a lot of the same options in terms of subject shift sensitivity, transition speed, and human only and human priority. Subject shift sensitivity is how quickly you want the camera to respond to the largest thing in frame. So if I'm talking, and then, the FR7 is on autofocus right now. If I'm talking, if something comes in front of my face, it'll rack focus to my hand, and then when my hand drops, it will pick my face back up again. And that's because I've set the subject shift sensitivity not to be locked on, but not to shift too quickly. I have it just right in the middle. Transition speed is how quickly you want the camera to rack between two items, how fast you want it to snap or slow. You might want it to slowly rack focus. Generally, out of the box, we think best practices is to just put both of those numbers right in the middle of their perspective scales and just kind of test like that. Sports tend to have subject shift sensitivity really high and transition speed really high. Cinema tends to have them on the lower end, but middle seems to make a lot of people happy. And then if you really want to, and if you have any customers or friends who are interested in learning more about autofocus, in the FX9 101, we did a whole autofocus section with just kind of examples and changing the transition speed and the subject shift sensitivity and seeing how you feel about it. Talking about color space, S-Gamut 3 and S-Gamut 3.Cine, similar to like the Venice, what we talked about last time, these same two color spaces are available in the Burano. When you're in OCN LT mode, that is just recording the metadata. So it's you have, when in OCN, OCN is capturing the native color space of the sensor. You go into grading, like DaVinci, you can set your timeline to be either .Cine or S-Gamut 3. When you are recording in XAVC, because that is inherently a video codec, you are making a choice whether it is S-Gamut or .Cine, meaning when you go into post, you don't get to make a decision anymore. It has been made for you. But general practice is to just use .Cine unless you see that .Cine or S-Gamut make a big difference to you. In the FX3 101, that's on Sony Cine's YouTube, there is a quick segment of color space, and it just kind of shows what it means between the two color spaces and what it might mean for your project. LUTs. I'm excited about, when we opened up the box, I think we were drooling over the fact that we have more LUT options out of the box than ever before. So we get S709 that we've always had and we love so much, but we also have Burano Cool, Teal and Orange, Warm, and Vintage. The Teal and Orange is what I have on right now. I like it. Oh my goodness, you're very dark. Oh, because I'm on. There we go. Am I in focus? Close. I really like it. I like that it adds the blues. I think I've heard a lot of people call it like a blockbuster LUT almost, because it feels like a high action movie, Transformers or something.
Katie, let's take a pause real quick. So does Katie has gone over the IBIS so far, and she's gone over XOCN, LT, and XAVC, the two recording codecs, and we've already informed you that this does not have the same sensor as the Venice. Does anyone want to see a demo maybe of the IBIS? Because Katie, you'd be able to switch over, right, and shake the camera.
Yes. Yeah.
Can we have a show of hands if you'd want to see like a demo of IBIS using the PL mount with what she has? Or if you have questions regarding the recording formats? Okay, no hands raised yet. So I think
I see KCS raised a hand.
Sam Gar raised a hand. Okay.
Okay, so this is what right now I've got a 15 a 15 on, and I set it in the menus like what we saw a little bit earlier. I'm going to turn the display information off so that way you guys can see it, and I'm just going to shake the camera.
Wait, Katie, and this is with the standard mode on a PL mount lens, right?
It's in low mode. So when
Okay.
we're in PL, it gives me low and high mode. When you're in the E mount, it gives me standard and active modes. So in the PL, I'm in low mode currently because I don't have a high option because I'm using a lot of the sensor. So this is just kind of like a basic. I'm shaking it. That looks pretty good. Okay, so then just for fun, I'm going to turn it off.
Katie, can you switch cameras? So before you turn it
Oh
off,
yes.
can you switch cameras and then let's show them how much you're shaking it and then we'll switch over.
Okay. So this is how much I'm shaking it. And then I'm going to go back to this. So this is with no stabilization on. Okay. So now I'm going to go back to low. That's pretty good. I really like.
Yeah, you can still see
Yeah.
the effect of the camera moving, but like we've done this experiment too when Katie uses like a Sony E-mount lens. And what's
Yeah.
the effect when you use an E-mount, Katie?
So when you use an E-mount lens, as we mentioned earlier, you can crop in more on the sensor, and there's more of a digital, when you're in active, there's more of a digital stabilization as well that's happening. So something that can work really well for you. I think, especially when we've done a lot of tests, it doesn't mean, it's not, I think the misconception can also be for some users is that I don't need a gimbal anymore. That is not accurate. But it really takes the edge off of handheld if you've got someone, especially if you're like running, you're doing a walk and talk, things like that. I would still operate as normal and walk how you're supposed to walk when you're operating, but it does take the edge off significantly. And then now I just want to cut to, I'm going to back out, and I'll cut to the side of the camera so you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to go change my project, my imager mode, record format. So I'm in the widest imager mode. Now I'm going to go down to a super 35. And then now I'm going to back out and I'm going to go back to my image stabilization. And now I can go, oh, I might have to go one more.
And we have tips and tricks for the menu for like IBIS and all that on the Sony Cine website as well. Of when you can go to active, what modes you need to be in, things like that.
Yeah, and there's also on Sony Cine, there's a Burano menu simulator, which is really exciting.
So Katie, I'm going to ask one more question. Another common question we get is about XOCN LT. So a lot of people, because when they find out that the Venice 2 sensor and the Burano sensor are different, they ask, does that mean that the XOCN LT on the Burano is more compressed, or is it just as good as the Venice 2?
That's a really good question. Yes. We get that question a lot. The OCN LT versus in Burano, as opposed to the OCN LT in Venice, the compression and the efficiency and the algorithms used to achieve XOCN LT are the same. The difference is going to be if you really start to dig into the two images and you were shooting Burano versus Venice 2, you really, really have to dive into it to see where the OCN LT and the Burano won't necessarily hold up against the Venice, but that's because the sensors are different. And then that's where the Venice 2 sensor is going to give you maybe a slightly maybe a better rendition of OCN LT because it's coming off of a different sensor. It's coming off of the Venice sensor. But generally, people that are testing the two, they're finding that they're almost identical, especially for practical applications. Not a lot of people are digging into the OCN LT so much in like a project setting or in a project that it would make a difference.
And then last question, with the show of hands, does anyone here, the various rental houses, are you seeing a lot of people who are reluctant to try Exocian LT, or are you seeing the opposite where they're eager to? And would it be helpful for Katie to mention some of the TV shows that are using Exocian LT? Do we see a show of hands? I don't see hands. Sorry, that was our fearless salesperson, Dan's ringtone. But I don't see any hands, so I think we're good to move on, Katie.
Okay. Did you, for the people that were interested in checking out the IBIS, did they feel confident about what they saw? Like, do you have more questions about it?
Any more questions on IBIS? I think what we'd want to see, and I don't know if we have a Burano with E-mount where we can show like what active stabilization looks like, Katie, but I think we're good. Does anyone here want to see what active stabilization, like the highest mode of stabilization, might look like? But in terms of Exocian LT, Law and Order uses LT, and Motherland uses LT, and Bel Air. So we're seeing more shows using it. It just depends on the deliverable. All right, Katie's gonna, the feed's not gonna look as good. It's gonna come from my computer while we log out of hers and log back in. But here you go.
Thank you. We love a good day with technical difficulties. It's our favorite.
So Katie right now is switching, taking the PL mount lens, PL mount off of the Burano, and we're gonna replace it with an E mount. So you can see how the active stabilization looks. Do we have any more questions for Katie while we're here? So, see, we had a couple of people who wanted to see this. Let's see what. So Nick says he's only seen one camera come back in LT. A lot of people don't use LT just because it's like listed like on the Venice XT, ST, and then LT. And because it's at the bottom, they decide that they don't want to, but it really depends on the deliverable, right, Katie?
Yeah.
Is anybody interested in receiving the Exocian white paper so you can read about the different formats of Sony RAW? If we were to put a link in the chat.
So there's definitely some interest. Yeah.
All right, we'll post the link in the chat.
Okay, I am still working on, I cannot get my laptop and video to work again. That's exciting. Either way, all I wanted to really point out was because, especially because we were starting to, we've been starting to test the IBIS and the stabilization a lot more. And some of the things that I've really noticed, especially when you're doing like a manual stabilization and you're using the low and the high modes as opposed to the E-mount stabilization and going into standard and active, is I think you, like what I mentioned, you still need to operate like an operator. So I'm just going to show you some of the ways that I've noticed it to work better. So I'm going to go start by pushing and holding the menu button. And then I'm going to go to project, and I'm going to go into record format, and I'm going to go to XAVC mode to be able to get the active and the standard to turn on in the menus. So it's just going to do a quick reboot. And then I'm going to push and hold the menu buttons to go into shooting. Oh, actually, I'm going to go to project and record format and just double check my imager. And I'm going to go to the Super 35 mode, go to shooting and image stabilization. And so I've got standard and active. I'm gonna do active. And then I also want to change, I'm at a F16, that's crazy. Let's go, okay, 4, I'm at 3200. Okay, cool. So like obviously if I walk, I think some of the guys the other day, they were walking just like this, and they were just like, and not necessarily operating, and it felt like the image stabilization was working overtime to compensate for that. So there is, I think, a little bit of a learning curve with some of the owners and operators who are going to start working with the Burano. And it's, again, just like finding the sweet spot, because just because image stabilization is on doesn't mean that you can just walk around and do all this crazy stuff. But where we really found success was if you were, you know, still walking as smooth as you could and doing the same thing. That's when it felt more natural, and it didn't feel like it was working overtime to compensate. It felt like that was it was this nice marriage between mechanical and digital to take the edge off of the handheld. And that, I think, was the nicer version of that. Going into, I think, if you start out in like a full frame mode and then you're like, I'm gonna go to active, and then you crop in a bunch, I think that was also just like a little bit of a learning curve, especially if you are operating the whole time at a particular imager mode, and then all of a sudden you crop in, just getting used to that and having to assess like how you're going to react or work with your subject. But I think the saving grace is that a lot of people who are going to be working with the Burano are probably going to be like owner operators, and they're going to find their sweet spot, and they're going to have, I mean, the good news is that there's so many options in this camera, especially with image stabilization, the auto ND, autofocus, blah, 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 that there's going to be a million different ways that everyone approaches each one of those functions. I mean, that was something over the last few days with a lot of people that have just kind of come through the DMPC, is just asking them like, hey, what do you think about this? Oh, try this. What if we did this? How do you feel about that? And there was no one good answer for image stabilization. If you're in standard, if you're in low, you're doing a PL, you're doing E-mount, there's just so many options. It gives you so much flexibility in every shooting situation. But it is quite interesting to see how everyone approaches it and how they kind of operate with each one, with image stabilization.
And then Katie, before we move on, can you do that kind of shaking test while it's on active mode, the way we had some DPs do to show how stable the image is?
Yeah, so I'm in active. I know this isn't the best way to show you, but I mean, I'm shaking it, and the image is, it looks like I'm not even moving the camera.
So
Yeah,
that's a popular test as well we got. And then we did get a question. I added some tips and tricks for the IBIS in there. And then let's see, we got a question about additional cage accessories to facilitate powering onboard monitors. I don't see any 12 or 24 power out options, and you are right, Will. So do you want to talk about Power Distro and who has accessories for that?
So in terms of power distribution, as you would imagine, unfortunately, or as you already noticed, that there's no power outs, no Hiroshi or 2-pin, 3-pin, 12 volt, 24 volt, or anything like that. However, power distribution methods like our friends at, I think I have one here. And this is just one example that I happen to have easily accessible, but this one is wooden camera. What they've done is they've got a special D box. I think a lot of manufacturers and third-party accessory companies are doing something similar, but they've got a 2-pin, a 3-pin, and then similar to the Venice, they've got like a D box cable going out, but they also have this power distro strip that's got, and it screws into the side, so it feels really hardy. But they also have a little function where you can do link out of the camera and remote into this little strip, and then you'll have run stop as well, that will pass out of the 12 volts and the 24 volts. But I know there's been also like Bright Tangerine has actually, I did not see Bright Tangerine, so I should not speak to that. But I know that
it came in the office though, and we posted photos of it on
Okay,
on
cool.
a Burano. But Katie, do you have any more slides you want to go over? I know I interrupted with some of the questions. Are there any other slides that you think would be helpful?
The big one that I wanted to really end with, because we were talking about the LUTs, we talked about autofocus. There's the monitor and control app. I would say that it is getting a lot closer to being easy to function with, because you can, if you've got an E-mount lens on, you can control iris, you can control the ND, and then coming in May, you'll be able to get false colors on the monitor feed. So, and that's internal on the Burano that you'll be able to connect with the camera. And then just the firmware roadmap, especially for some people, like with the S700 protocol for RCP support and things like that, that is coming. And it looks like it's going to be coming. Oh, it is August to September for the 1.5D squeeze, and then for S700 protocol over Ethernet. So, and then these one TBD on availability or when it will be coming, but there's a few other things that would be coming in addition too. But that was the big one that I want to show. And then as always, our big cinema lineup with the Burano included in there.
And then before we hand it off for more questions, and Michael, thank you for your post. Katie, I'm going to post the FX3 all file with the downloadable presets for the FX3. Can you, I'm going to post this, and I'd love to hear if people want an all file for the Burano, but Katie, maybe you can like touch on what this file does.
The FX3 all file is something that we sat down with like a lot of DPs that come through the DMPC, and I just noticed that there was a lot of settings that we were constantly having to change the FX3 to, and so then we just kind of created an all file based off of all of that testing and feedback. But essentially it takes the FX3 into a world where you wanted to, if you're shooting on, like you're going to go shoot a feature, it's going to be a B camera to Venice or something to that effect. So it does stuff like it puts you in 24, in DCI 4096. It makes your time code settings ready to go. It gives you particular frame lines if that's what you're looking for. It assigns, like in the My menus, it gives you easy access things like if you're formatting your card, if you want to change your HDMI output, stuff like that. So that's what the FX3 all file is. The Burano all file, I'm still working through where they would assign their buttons to, because it seems like they are all changing. So I know once everybody gets the Burano in their hands and everybody will start settling in, then we'll probably end up doing an all file. But I'm always interested in knowing where everybody's assigning their buttons.
Yeah, and essentially it just makes your most used used menu items easily accessible through assignable buttons, and customizes your menu. And with that, I think that concludes the high level of the training. Do we have any questions? I added a link to thank you, Sam. I added a link to the Burano webpage, which had the tools that Katie showed, the recording formats chart, the recording times chart as well, and the menu simulator. And it looks like that is it. We don't have any questions. And with that, thank you so much, Katie. Thank you, Harry. We'll hand it over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, you guys. That was a marathon or a sprint. So thank you so much to Sony for bringing us to us. And yeah, thanks everybody for coming.